This is a novel in which one character showing another character how to tie their shoelaces is a major plot event. There's no real plot in this novel in the traditional sense of introduction, complication, or resolution. But that kind of plot, the plots that we are all familiar with from the many traditional novels we have read, those kind of plots are a trick. They are an illusion of art, because our lives simply do not follow the kind of neat patterns that we find in the plots of traditional novels. The only way to create that kind of order in life or in a novel is to invent it, to impose beginnings, to invent turning points, to invent conclusions. So, like Eliot, like Picasso, and like many, many other artists of her time, Virginia Woolf broke with artistic tradition. She broke first and foremost, and as you've likely noticed, with the convention of traditional plot. And instead what she did was she narrated events as they occur to consciousness, so-called stream of consciousness narration. Stream of consciousness is a term that was borrowed from the American pragmatist philosopher William James. For him, it meant something like the unbroken flow of thought in the waking mind. In literature, stream of consciousness is a narrative technique that attempts to capture the way that our minds actually perceive the world. Around the time that she was writing to the Lighthouse, Virginia Woolf wrote this in her diary. The method of writing smooth narrative can't be right. Things don't happen in one's mind like that. We experience all the time an overlapping of images and ideas, and modern novels should convey our mental confusion instead of neatly arranging it. The reader must sort it out. A simple example. I'm on page 92 in this edition. We're in the mind of Mrs. Ramsey. She's thinking. There were the eternal problems, suffering, death, the poor. There was always a woman dying of cancer, even here. And yet she had said to all these children, "You shall go through it all." To 8 people, she had said relentlessly that, and the bill for the greenhouse would be £50. For that reason, knowing what was before them, love and ambition and being wretched alone in dreary places, she had often the feeling, why must they grow up and lose it all? So in the middle of this profound sequence of thoughts, of death, cancer, the happiness of her children, loneliness, the thought flashes through her mind that it's going to cost £50 to fix the roof on the greenhouse. That is how our minds actually work, because we're incapable of focusing on any one thing for too long without another thought interrupting that thought. Try it. Try thinking about one thing for 30 seconds without anything else entering your mind. Confucius says that if you can do that, you can rule the world. In a realistic novel, we are presented with the illusion that the characters move and the narrator follows them. That's obviously an illusion. Characters in novels don't move anywhere. Characters in novels are not real. They only exist in our imagination. In a Virginia Woolf novel, it's less that the characters move, it's more that the narrative voice moves around. The narrator moves, the characters stay still. And that narrative eye, that narrative mind, picks up on whatever scene it happens to be passing at the moment. So in the first chapter, for instance, which begins in their summer home in the Hebrides, the narrator mind, the narrator's eye, picks up the action in the kitchen. James, the son, is cutting out pictures from a magazine to tape on the fridge. The narrator then goes out onto the terrace with 2 other characters, Mr. Ramsey and Charles Tansley, a visiting scholar. Later that evening, the narrator moves and follows the family into the dining room. And then still later, it moves upstairs with the children to bed and to the attic. So like the minds of the characters in this novel, the narrator's mind mimics the way our minds actually perceive the world. Roaming, stopping here, seizing on this, ignoring that. The narrative voice into the lighthouse is like, and I think consciously modeled on, the wind that blows through this house on the edge of the sea all the time, through the open doorways, through the open windows, observing whatever it sees. To the Lighthouse reinvents another staple of traditional plot-driven fiction, and that is characterization. The author of the traditional novel knows everything about his or her character. The author of the traditional novel is omniscient, godlike. They made up this character so they can tell us anything there is to know about them because they know it all. Virginia Woolf does not pretend to know everything about Mrs. Ramsey. Instead, what she does is give us multiple impressions of Mrs. Ramsey from the people around her. And she lets us add those impressions up. Virginia Woolf's comment that modern novels should convey our mental confusion implies that she is endorsing a new kind of realism. That what she's saying is, look, the world is confusing, therefore art must be confusing to imitate it. But like Eliot, Woolf is up to something much more complicated than just, the world is a mess, so I will write a poem that is a mess, or I will write a novel that is a mess. This is a tremendously carefully paced and tremendously carefully structured novel. This is Virginia Woolf's sketch in her notebook of the structural design of this novel. Well, it's actually my sketch of her sketch. 2 blocks joined by a corridor. Her words, 2 blocks joined by a corridor. So on the left block, part 1 of the novel, The Window, which is one day in the life of one family, the Ramseys, in their summer home in the Isle of Skye, part of the Hebrides off the west coast of Scotland. On the right, we have another block, part 3, the final part, which is about part of another day, 10 years later, in the same place, same family. 2 blocks of time connected by a short corridor of time, the middle section of the novel, which is called Time Passes. So on the surface, To the Lighthouse is a series of fleeting impressions, right? Those stream of consciousness perceptions, little moments of perception. But underneath that stream of consciousness duration, there is a very solid and in some ways quite traditional structure, beginning, middle, end. If you think about how the Ramseys' visiting friend, the artist, Lily Briscoe, is a painter, central character in the novel. Think about how she says she wants her painting to look. She says at one point that she wants her painting to look like a butterfly's wing lying upon the arches of a cathedral. That's not what she's painting, it's what she wants it to look like. A butterfly's wing lying upon the arch of a cathedral. Fleeting impressions laid over top of a solid foundation. Butterflies on cathedral arches. That much scholars have said many times about this book. Critics like Eric Auerbach, for instance. I think, and I'm going to try to suggest to you, that there is a particular kind of cathedral arch holding the butterflies up in this novel. A particular kind of structure, narrative structure. To the Lighthouse does not open with what readers of 19th century novels would have expected, and that is a formal introduction to the story. Once upon a time, or my name is, call me Ishmael. It opens in mid-conversation with an answer to a question that we don't hear. The answer is, yes, of course, if it's fine tomorrow. It's Mrs. Ramsey promising James that they will make the trip to the lighthouse if the weather is fine tomorrow. We don't hear the question, only the answer. It opens in the middle of things. So instead of starting with the conventional once upon a time opening, she has used another quite conventional opening, but for a different genre. Because this novel begins in medias res, Latin for in the middle of things. Instead of starting at the beginning of the story, she is starting at a critical point in the action, the critical point in the action. The argument between Mr. and Mrs. Ramsey about whether or not they will take James to the lighthouse tomorrow. Now that kind of beginning, to begin in the middle of things, is appropriate when the audience knows the backstory. So they can fill in the story for themselves because they already know it. Homer started the Iliad in exactly this way. Homer begins the Iliad in the 10th and final year of the attack on Troy because his audience already knew the story of the kidnapping of Helen and the story of the Greek expedition to recover her. So they didn't need the backstory. They could jump right into the middle of the action at the critical point. But the thing is this, To the Lighthouse is not one of those public stories that everybody knows before they open the book up. So why would Woolf use this kind of opening? An opening that is appropriate to stories that we already know. Why didn't she introduce us to a story that we don't know, to characters that we don't know? Partly, I think the decision to begin in the middle of things is to get us into the story as quickly as possible, to make us, the reader, feel as if we too are guests at the Ramsey summer home, part of an ongoing conversation. And it's tremendously effective. But it is also, I think, an announcement of method, a declaration of method, a generic clue. Because to begin in medias res, in the middle of things, is a convention of a particular literary genre. And that's Homer's genre. It's the genre of the epic. Now, traditionally, the epic is a long narrative poem that tells a serious story in a very serious style about a hero on whom depends the fate of a people, a nation, an entire race. There are not many such poems. The epic is a tremendously demanding form that requires encyclopedic knowledge of a culture and a tremendous amount of chutzpah, a lot of self-confidence, because the epic poet tells the story of a people, of an entire people. Beowulf, the Iliad, the Odyssey, Virgil's Aeneid, Milton's Paradise Lost, Dante's Divine Comedy, and I want to suggest to you, to the Lighthouse, though in a very different way from those epics. Virginia Woolf knew the conventions of epic poetry tremendously well. This is a woman who taught herself to read Homer in Greek when she was 8 years old. So this is somebody who knows her Homer. When she visited Greece and Turkey as a teenager, she traveled with a copy of Homer's Odyssey in her handbag. And the Woolf's close friend, James Joyce, had just reworked the story of Homer's Odyssey in his Ulysses, published in 1922, just 5 years before this novel. Virginia Woolf did not like Ulysses. She called it pretentious, which is sort of the pot calling the kettle black, but we'll let that go. I think she did what James Joyce did. I think she took Homer's epic form and she rewrote it for a different time, and in her case, for a different gender. The cathedral arches of the epic, its conventional structures, they are all here, or conspicuously and deliberately absent in this new epic. The traditional epic begins in medias res, in the middle of things. So does to the Lighthouse. But the similarity is much more specific than that, and the difference is tremendously significant. The Iliad, if you remember, opens with a quarrel. It starts with a quarrel between Agamemnon, king of the Greeks, and his most powerful warrior, Achilles. And what they're arguing over is who is going to get to bed a particular slave girl, Briseis. Who will get to keep the slave girl and take her back to her tent? Two men arguing over a girl. To the Lighthouse opens up with a quarrel between a wife and her husband about whether or not they will take their son to the lighthouse tomorrow. Page 9, first page of the book. Excuse me. Yes, of course, if it's fine tomorrow, said Mrs. Ramsey. But you'll have to be up at the Lark, she added. To her son, these words conveyed an extraordinary joy. As if it were settled, the expedition were bound to take place, and the wonder to which he had looked forward for years and years, it seemed, was, after a night's darkness and a day's sail, within touch. Since he belonged, even at that age of 6, to that great clan which cannot keep this feeling separate from that, but must let future prospects, with their joys and sorrows, cloud what is actually at hand. Since to such people, even in earliest childhood, any turn in the wheel of sensation has the power to crystallize and transfix the moment upon which its gloom or radiance rests. James Ramsey, sitting on the floor, cutting out pictures from the illustrated catalog of the Army and Navy stores, endowed the picture of a refrigerator, as his mother spoke, with heavenly bliss. It was fringed with joy. The wheelbarrow, the lawnmower, the sound of poplar trees, leaves whitening before rain, rooks cawing, brooms knocking, dresses rustling. All these were so colored and distinguished in his mind that he had already his private code, his secret language, though he appeared the image of stark and uncompromising severity, with his high forehead and his fierce blue eyes, impeccably candid and pure, frowning slightly at the sight of human frailty, so that his mother, watching him all red and ermine on the bench, or directing a stern and momentous, imagined him directing a stern and momentous enterprise in some crisis of public affairs. But, said his father, stopping in front of the drawing room window, it won't be fine. Had there been an axe handy, or a poker, any weapon that would have gashed a hole in his father's breast and killed him there and then, James would have seized it. As childlike Achilles, sulking in his tent. Most importantly, the distinction between the two, the Iliad opens up with a quarrel between two men over a girl. This opens up with a quarrel between parents over a child. The traditional epic is written in a very serious, high style. I don't think I need to spend a lot of time convincing you that this is not newspaper prose. But again, the similarity is much more specific than that, and the difference significant. One marker of the high style in a classical epic is what is called a Homeric or epic simile. A Homeric simile is a simile in which the vehicle is very, very long and elaborate. Okay? So not just the sky is like a red balloon, but the sky is like and goes on for lines. An example. Excuse me. From Homer's Iliad. As when a wild boar lusty hunters and hounds deploy, until the beast trots out from heavy thicket, whetting his white tusks against his lower jaws. The hounds go circling into attack, and under the hue and cry a gnashing sound of tusks and teeth is heard. Even so, around rugged Odysseus, the Trojans ran. So the way an epic simile works is that the Homeric poet, whether Homer himself or we don't really know, is reciting this poem back home in Greece to men and women who were not at Troy, who have no idea what it looked like to see those dogs of Trojans circling round rugged Odysseus. So what they're trying to do is say, look, you have never seen this. You don't know what it looked like, but you have hunted, and you have seen the dogs circling a wild boar, with the wild boar in the middle and the strength holding back those dogs. That is what it was like. That's how a Homeric simile works. It's like that. Woolf uses epic similes repeatedly throughout this novel, and bear in mind that the epic simile is not a convention of the novel. It belongs to the form of poetry. An example, page 250. We're in the mind here of one of the daughters, Cam. And as sometimes happens, when a cloud falls on a green hillside and gravity descends, and there among all the surrounding hills is gloom and sorrow, and it seems as if the hills themselves must ponder the fate of the clouded, the darkened, either in pity or maliciously rejoicing in her dismay, so Cam now felt herself overcast as she sat there among calm, resolute people and wondered how to answer her father about the puppy. And as so, there's dozens of them in the book. If you look for them, they are Homeric similes, and they are a mark of Virginia Woolf's influence and her argument with Homer. Because Homer compares war to hunting. A male subject, a male vehicle in his simile. Virginia Woolf compares feelings in the mind of a girl to the weather. Domestic subject, domestic vehicle. Masculine subject, masculine vehicle. Over and over again, she reworks Homer's similes using domestic rather than military vehicles for her comparisons. In a traditional epic, the setting of the poem is vast. In the traditional epic, the setting is often much of the world, even places outside the world, like Dante's Heaven or Homer's Underworld. The setting of To the Lighthouse is one home, one family's home. But as several of these characters say, their home is the world. Therein lies the difference. The traditional epic involves superhuman deeds, right? A great warrior, a long and arduous journey. Knitting a reddish-brown stocking for a lightkeeper's son doesn't really seem like a superhuman deed. But maybe that's not the epic deed of To the Lighthouse. Recall the title of the book, To the Lighthouse. At the risk of spoiling the ending for you, in case you haven't got there, what could possibly be a longer, more arduous journey than the trip to the lighthouse, which is the reconciliation of a son with his father? And again, the similarity to classic epic is even more specific than that. Homer's Iliad ends with the Greeks still at Troy, which sets up the sequel. Homer thought like a Hollywood movie producer. Homer duly provided the sequel in the Odyssey, one of the many Greek stories, the one that's left to us now, of the homecomings, the nostoi, of the Greek heroes back home to Greece after the war in Troy. He tells one story in particular, the story of Odysseus, the return to his home and his reunion with his wife and son, Penelope and Telemachus. Now, recall that it has taken 10 years for the Ramseys to return to their summer home in part 3. 10 years for James to complete his trip to the lighthouse. Does anybody remember how long it took Odysseus to get home from Troy? 10 years. Maybe you'll remember as well what Penelope, Odysseus' wife, what she was doing while her husband was away at war. She was entertaining a house full of male guests, many of them, who seek her hand, and with it Odysseus' kingdom. She manages to hold them off for a decade. She does this by she promises them that she will choose one among them as her husband when she has completed weaving this tapestry. So every morning she weaves a bit more on the tapestry. At night she goes up and she unweaves the day's work. Smart woman. Now you look at page 13. This is Mrs. Ramsey talking about the guests that visit them at their summer home, mostly men. She says she could not bear incivility to her guests, to young men in particular, who were poor as church mice. Indeed, she had the whole of the other sex under her protection, for reasons she could not explain, for their chivalry and valor, for the fact that they negotiated treaties, ruled India, controlled finance. The suitors at Penelope's home in the Odysseus are themselves kings. Finally, for an attitude toward herself which no woman could fail to feel or to find agreeable, which an old woman could take from a young man without loss of dignity. She's Penelope, Queen Penelope, surrounded by her suitors. Final clue, and the one that for me nailed this reading down. Now, depending on how you count, and this is hard because it's in Greek. My Greek is rusty, non-existent. Depending on how you count, in Homer's Odyssey, there are either 108 or 110 male suitors in Penelope's home. Charles Tansley, we're told on that page, is the 110th young man to visit them at their summer home. It's deliberate. The final and most important convention of the classical epic is that the hero is a figure of great national and even cosmic importance. This is somebody, as I've said, on whom depends the fate of an entire people. Achilles, Innis, Adam. The hero is a man. To the Lighthouse is an epic, but it is a domestic epic. It is the epic of a family, not the epic of a nation. This novel is not just a rewriting of the epic form, any more than James Joyce's Ulysses was a rewriting of the epic form. This novel is a critique of the epic, of the male epic. It is a feminist critique of the most important genre in Western literary history, a feminist critique written by a woman who did not like the word feminism. Because the classic epic asserted over and over again in so many different cultures that what mattered was men, men's quarrels, men's adventures. Helen doesn't matter. What matters is the war fought over Helen. Penelope doesn't matter. What matters is her husband's return. And Virginia Woolf knew all this. In her first and most important feminist book, A Room of One's Own, 1929, she argued that one of the main problems confronting women writers in her time was that male values inevitably get transferred from life to fiction. She said this: speaking crudely, football and sport are important. The worship of fashion, the buying of clothes, trivial. And these values are inevitably transferred from life to fiction. This is an important book, the critic assumes, because it deals with war. This is an insignificant book because it deals with the feelings of women in a drawing room. There's an almost comic version of this antithesis. Well, comic for Virginia Woolf doesn't mean much, okay? But there's an almost comic version of this antithesis in To the Lighthouse. At one point, well, several points, Mr. Ramsey is striding across the lawn, quoting lines from The Charge of the Light Brigade. Boldly we rode and well. He's walking across the line, reciting this poem out loud to himself, and he almost knocks over Lily, painting on her easel. Lily is painting a picture of a mother and her child. So we have a man walking across the lawn in front of the home, reciting a war poem, who almost knocks over a woman artist painting a picture of a mother and a child. It's a joke. It's a Virginia Woolf joke, which is why you're not laughing. Not exactly known for her sense of humor. In A Room of One's Own, Virginia Woolf wrote this. She said, "There is no reason to think that the form of the epic suits a woman any more than the male style of writing, the male sentence, suits her." Into the Lighthouse, she reinvented both of them. She reinvented the epic, and she reinvented literary style. She brought the epic quarrel into the kitchen, into the house, and she made the epic hero a woman. Domestic novels were certainly possible before Virginia Woolf, novels about women's lives. There were thousands of them, most of them written by women writers, and read quite often. But although these books were read, they were rarely respected, rarely read as literature. Even Virginia Woolf was only willing herself to accept about a half dozen women writers before her as real writers. A half dozen in the English language, that's it. With Virginia Woolf, what happens is that domestic scenes, women's lives, become a subject for art. Not just fiction, not just entertainment, art. Virginia Woolf did not make Danielle Steele possible. Danielle Steele would have been possible without Virginia Woolf. She made Toni Morrison possible, Margaret Atwood. The woman who did all this was born in London in 1882. She was the middle daughter of 4 children. Her father, Leslie Stephen, was a well-known British academic. He was the first editor of the Dictionary of National Biography. Her mother, Julia, of which no good pictures exist, supposed to be a tremendous beauty. She was the daughter of a doctor who spent most of his career in India. She was very active in charities, including pure milk supply for the poor, which is one of Mrs. Ramsey's preoccupations, into the Lighthouse. Virginia's mother died when she was just 13 years old. Her father died when she was 22, and her older brother Toby when she was 24, with whom she was very close. After her father's death, the surviving children bought a home in a district of London called Bloomsbury. And so began the famous and so-called Bloomsbury Group. It's a loose collection of friends, artists, intellectuals, writers, loosely centered on the homes of Virginia and her friends, most active around 1904 to 1914, just before the First World War. They're liberated. Liberated sexually, liberated politically, liberated intellectually. Most of them were pacifists during the war, and all of them were socialists throughout. They're the first generation to publicly regard homosexuality as normal, as merely a consequence of friendship. There are a great deal of complicated sexual relations going on in the Bloomsbury Group at this time. It's a world of witty conversation, cocktails, cigarettes, love affairs, and changing the world. The group included the novelist E.M. Forster, the painters Roger Fry and Virginia's sister, Vanessa Bell, biographer Linton Strachey, and the economist, Maynard Keynes. Must have been an unlikely companion. Virginia married one of the group. She married Leonard Woolf, who was a former civil servant, who later wrote the draft for the Charter of the League of Nations. He was very, very active, was Leonard, in socialist and labor groups. Woolf's sister, Vanessa Bell, became a painter, a prominent member of the British post-impressionist groups. This is Vanessa's painting of her sister Virginia, a detail from it, 1911. Virginia turned to writing at a young age, first as a journalist, then as a novelist. She published her first novel, The Voyage Out, in 1915. She published this book when she was 33, which is Lily's age in part 1 of To the Lighthouse. To the Lighthouse is her 5th novel. She started writing it in August of 1925, and she finished it in January of 1927, the year that it was published. This is the first edition of the novel, with cover design by her sister Vanessa. It was published by the Hogarth Press, which is a small press that Leonard and Virginia started in their home in 1917. It published books that commercial presses would not take. Catherine Mansfield, Forster. The first British edition of Eliot's The Wasteland was published by this press. In fact, Virginia Woolf set the type for The Wasteland herself. It's one of those remarkable moments in literary history. You have Virginia Woolf setting the type for The Wasteland. She wrote 6 more novels after To the Lighthouse, hundreds of essays, and 2 books that are called feminist, not her word. On 28 March 1941, 2 years into another war, she left notes for Vanessa and Leonard, walked to the river near her house, put a large rock in her pocket for weight, and she drowned herself. She was 59. She had had several serious breakdowns before. She twice attempted suicide, at least twice. The first time was in her early 20s, and the second was just after she was married in her early 30s. There have been many explanations offered over the years as to why she did this. Recent scholarship is focusing on she was abused, apparently, by a half-brother, Gerald. There was the war, the First World War, and then the war again. And also, and I think probably importantly to Virginia Woolf, more importantly than it would be to most of us, she felt she was losing her talent as a writer, that she'd said all she had to say. Virginia Woolf is an artist, and if she didn't have that, I don't think she knew what to do. Those who knew her best said that she did it because she had been insane before. She'd been there before, and she could feel herself going back there again, and she just didn't want to do it again. To the Lighthouse is based on her own family. Mrs. Ramsey is based on her mother, Julia. Mr. Ramsey is based on her father. There's another Virginia Woolf joke in there, because you'll recall that Mr. Ramsey is constantly trying to get through the alphabet, trying to get to Z mentally. Well, Virginia's father is the editor of the Dictionary National Biography, which is organized alphabetically. I think he only ever got to C or something like that. I can't remember. James is based on her youngest brother, Adrian. And I suspect Lily is based, at least in part, on herself. The house is a summer home that the Stephens rented in Cornwall, which is at the opposite end of Britain from where the novel is fictionally set. This is St. Ives Lighthouse in Cornwall, which is the actual model of the lighthouse in the book. It depicts something of the same malaise as Eliot's poetry of the 1920s, same time frame. The inability to communicate, the sense that nothing is authentic or meaningful anymore, the privacy of experience, everybody shut behind their respective closed doors. In the dinner scene, in the first part of To the Lighthouse, they're all there together as a family and friends, but each of them is locked in their own mental world. They're separate, even though they're together. And as in The Wasteland, in the wake of war, these are people looking for meaning, looking for answers. Page 268. This is Lily. Towards the end of the book. She's talking or addressing in her mind Mr. Carmichael. What was it then? What did it mean? Could things thrust their hands up and grip one? Could the blade cut, the fist grasp? Was there no safety? No learning by heart of the ways of the world? Could it be, even for elderly people, that this was life? Startling, unexpected, unknown. For one moment, she felt that if they both got up, here, now on the lawn, and demanded an explanation, why was it so short? Why was it so inexplicable? Said it with violence, as two fully equipped human beings from whom nothing should be hid might speak. Then, beauty would roll itself up. The space would fill. Those empty flourishes would form into shape. If they shouted loud enough, Mrs. Ramsey would return. Mrs. Ramsey, she said aloud. Mrs. Ramsey. Lily's looking for meaning, for an answer. They all are. This is Woolf's version of the fable that Eliot tells in The Wasteland, of gods, men, and demons assembling before their Creator and saying, "Speak to us, O Lord. Give us the answer. What is the answer? What is the Holy Grail?" But this book offers answers that are different from Eliot's. Page 255. Excuse me. This is Lily, about what she wants her painting to look like. Beautiful and bright it should be on the surface, feathery and evanescent, one color melting into another, like the colors on a butterfly's wing. But beneath, the fabric must be clamped together with bolts of iron. It was to be a thing that you could ruffle with your breath, and a thing you could not dislodge with a team of horses. What Lily wants in her painting, her post-impressionist painting, is ephemeral beauty on the surface, bolts of iron underneath. She wants what Virginia Woolf wanted for this book, butterflies on cathedral arches. And, crucially, it is Mrs. Ramsey that Lily wants to paint. That is what her painting is of. All the other painters that are there in the neighborhood, and there are many of them, they're all there to paint the seascape. We're on the island. They're impressionist painters. They set up their easels facing the water. Lily turns her back on the water. She looks into the house. She wants to paint a picture of her mother and a child. She is not alone in seeing something special, something remarkable in this woman. In the first part, Mr. Banks experiences what he calls a rapture, watching Mrs. Ramsey read to her son James. He says that watching a mother read a story to her son has the same effect on him as solving a science problem. That it's like seeing chaos subdued, order made. The answer is not to be found for either Lily or Virginia Woolf in just beauty, in just those butterflies on the surface. It's not in art for art's sake alone. The answer is not to be found in Mr. Ramsey's facts, his quest to get past Q to Z. The answer, to the extent that there is one, is inside Mrs. Ramsey. Lily says, that inside Mrs. Ramsey are sacred inscriptions, her words, that if you could only read them, would, her words, teach you everything. Inside a mother. It's like Eliot's Da, right? It's the answer. It's what the Grail would say if you asked it the right question. That is what Lily is trying to paint in her painting. And just like Eliot's Da, the answer is hidden, private, never made public. We never get to see Lily's painting. Stroke of genius. The worst decision a publisher could ever make for this novel would be to put their idea of what the painting looks like on the cover of this book. So the whole point is that we don't see it. It's private, and therefore greater than anything real ever could be. Even though we can't see the answer, we can see enough to know that there are some very important differences between T.S. Eliot's Da, the answer we hear in The Wasteland, and the sacred inscriptions that are inside Mrs. Ramsey. Page 78. Lily again. Sitting on the floor with her arms round Mrs. Ramsey's knees, close as she could get, smiling to think that Mrs. Ramsey would never know the reason of that pressure, she imagined how in the chambers of the mind and heart of the woman who was physically touching her were stood, like the treasures in the tombs of kings, tablets bearing sacred inscriptions, which, if one could spell them out, would teach one everything. But they would never be offered openly, never made public. Could loving, as people called it, make her and Mrs. Ramsey one? For it was not knowledge, but unity that she desired, not inscriptions on tablets, nothing that could be written in any language known to men, but intimacy itself, which is knowledge, she had thought, leaning her head on Mrs. Ramsey's knee. Lily knows that the answer is not going to come from a hand holding a sword emerging from a pool, Excalibur. She says myth is nonsense, of course. The Fisher King, which sufficed for Eliot, will not suffice for Woolf. Myth and ritual will not do. Religion will not do. God will not do. Mrs. Ramsey gets annoyed with herself for thinking that we are in the hands of the Lord. We can't go back to those answers, not anymore. Charles Tansley is an atheist in the novel. They laugh at him. But they're not laughing at him because he's an atheist. They're laughing at him because he feels like he needs to say it over and over again. Of course there's no God. Not for these people, not in this place. The answer for these people is much closer to home than religion or myth. The answer is in daily life. The answer is in intimacy. Page 240. Lily, what is the meaning of life? That was all. A simple question, but one that tended to close in on one with years. The great revelation had never come. The great revelation perhaps never did come. Instead, there were little daily miracles, illuminations, matches struck unexpectedly in the dark. Here was one, this, that, and the other. Herself and Charles Tansley and the breaking wave. Mrs. Ramsey bringing them together. Mrs. Ramsey saying, life stand still here. Mrs. Ramsey making of the moment something permanent. This was of the nature of a revelation. In the midst of chaos, there was shape. This eternal passing and flowing was struck into stability. Life stands still here, Mrs. Ramsey said. Mrs. Ramsey, she repeated. She owed it all to her. There's no great revelation. Excuse me. Just little daily miracles. Matches struck unexpectedly in the dark. Butterflies landing on cathedral arches. It is tremendously tempting to see the differences between Eliot's answers and Virginia Woolf's answers as gendered. That is, Eliot looks for the great revelation. He talks to gods. He gets answers like da. Woolf looks to daily miracles. Eliot looks for order in ritual, in myth. Woolf looks to the home, to the kitchen. But the problem with a gendered reading is that the book's main example of this intimacy is not between Lily and Mrs. Ramsey. The main example of this intimacy is James's reconciliation with his father at the end of the book. The answer into the wasteland comes in one word, da. Into the lighthouse, the answer comes in two words. And those words are, in my mind, well done. Well done. Those are the words that Mr. Ramsey gives to his son James after the death of Mrs. Ramsey when they have finally completed the voyage to the lighthouse. And he is giving those words to his son to thank him and commend him for bringing the boat safely to the lighthouse. Well done. That's where we started, the trip to the lighthouse. James has finally got what he always wanted from his father, and that is approval, recognition, intimacy. Back on shore, Lily, watching all this take place from a distance, says aloud, "He has landed. It is finished." And after she says this, the poet, old Mr. Carmichael, stands up beside her. And the novel represents old Mr. Carmichael at this point as Poseidon. It says that his book looks like a trident and that he has weeds coming from his hair. Poseidon was Odysseus' persecutor in the Odyssey. Here, he stands up and he gives his blessing to Lily. With that blessing from Poseidon, that reworked Poseidon for a different time and a different gender, Lily can finally finish her painting. She says, I have had my vision. I have had my vision. The thing is this, Lily's vision is not a vision of the triumph of Achilles or the glory of Rome. Her vision is of a father and his son, of a mother and her son. It is a vision of intimacy, of small miracles, butterflies and cathedrals. It is a vision of quarrels between peoples, people, not between nations. In her notes for To the Lighthouse, Virginia Woolf wrote this. She said, how much more important divisions between people are than between countries. How much more important divisions between people are than between countries. That, I think, is the answer of To the Lighthouse. And it is also Virginia Woolf's contribution to the literature of our time. Thank you.